What is the worst thing you have seen a church do in the name of God? My grandmother was an active member of a large conservative church for her entire adult life. This church was a predominantly white church, located in the deep south of the USA. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights and supported many youth programs. She always donated, and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. I remember that, on a youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials. One of the assistant pastors had forgotten it and asked her to get it in time for our morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, never found out that the assistant pastor had screwed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. He never even thanked Grandma. Regardless, she didn't mind at all and said her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73, when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound. She could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home. Every one of these invitations was declined. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor. She had known him for over 30 years, and wanted him to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. The senior pastor was too busy, but the assistant pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting. Grandma, grandpa and the assistant pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then the pastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then the pastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs, because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. The pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, citing Bible verses in support. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. Grandpa physically grabbed the pastor and escorted him out of their house. 6 months later, Grandma passed away and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not the white church. None of the church's members were invited. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited the senior and assistant pastor from this funeral service. You all know me and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife. You can tell a story about her that is worth remembering, or anything else that you want to say that will honor her memory. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so." There were about 100 people at the service. At least a third of them stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours. As best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying and hugging. 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills. They worked hard and lived modestly, but it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. So we held a reading of the will, which was a tradition in our family. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value. They were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa, that Grandma's will contain some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included dozens of family members. We were all surprised, however, to see the senior pastor and assistant pastor from the white church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for the church itself, but also for them personally. My siblings, cousins and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that the senior and assistant pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these 2 preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, we all noticed that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely. It would also be practically impossible for them to escape the overflowing room before the entire meeting was over because they were farthest from the room's single door. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts and everything that remained after all of the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren and several local charities received generous amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was the first beneficiary listed in the will. But, after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s, then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece and nephew received a little more, then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts, and so on. Bequests to the White Church, senior pastor and assistant pastor were almost the last ones listed in the will. They listened with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the White Church and preacher's part of the will, he said, "Before I announce these bequests to the White Church, and both pastors, I have a statement to read." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. "For the past 10 years, not one person from the White Church ever checked on me. Not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, who I loved dearly and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many years. But when I needed you in your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit. When I was dying, I invited the senior pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still love dearly even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear the senior pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But the senior pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. The assistant pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the very last time. The assistant pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include 20% of my entire estate for what was now my former church. This amount was a truckload. But I felt bad that we had not personally remembered such nice people as the senior pastor and assistant pastor. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to the White Church to match all of the love that they have shown to me during the last 10 years of my life. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to the assistant pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to senior pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to the White Church, 1 cent. Both pastors sat there, mouths gaping. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud. But we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. The best was yet to come. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a local black charity, then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea who the black charity was. But, by the looks on their faces, we could tell that the pastors knew this charity very well. Their faces shared the same expressions of shock, dread and horror. Every eye in the room was now fixated on both pastors. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, let the silence continue a few seconds more. If we had been able to read both pastors' minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. This charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from the White Church. They ran various assistance programs for all kinds of people. A long time ago, the White Church, which was and still is 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial support to the black charity. Then there was a very bitter breakup, allegedly because the charity was practicing the social gospel, while the White Church was preaching the true gospel. The White Church even sued to get some of their money back. But, this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why the White Church, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity. The black church hadn't been staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving the White Church at the time but stayed to reach some of the youth at their White Church and break the generational cycle of racism. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to the black charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But both pastors obviously understood what Grandma was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, and the pastors had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These human beings, whom you hate and have mistreated, are better people than you are. So they deserve my money more than you do." Then the lawyer said, the amount is and named the exact same amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to the White Church if she had not changed her will.